You can now get 2 free audiobook downloads and a 30-day free trial at audible.bogosity.tv. Your choice from the world's largest selection of over 180,000 digital audiobooks and spoken word content for your iOS or Android device, Kindle, or MP3 player. Go to audible.bogosity.tv now. Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the week of June 3rd, 2018, the podcast that keeps the loonies on the path. This is your host, Shane Killian, and this week let's welcome a very special guest host, Esoteric Entity. Welcome to the podcast, Eso.
Hey, pretty early here. Didn't get much sleep last night because I was excited about this.
So for those of you who don't know Esoteric Entity, he's another YouTube ANCAP, so I'll have the link to his channel there in the show notes. So without further ado, let's multi-segmentate the news of the Bogus. So the Supreme Court has ruled 7-2 in favor of Jack Phillips, the Colorado baker who didn't want to bake a cake for a same-sex couple. It's a good result, even if the ruling's a bit convoluted. What gets me is what NBC, USA Today, NPR, the AP, and a whole bunch of others said. The Supreme Court narrowly ruled this way. 7-2 is narrowly, according to the fake news media?
Yeah, that's the most concerning aspect of it to me, was that they covered this as if this was some sort of loss on a civil rights ground.
Oh yeah, of course. But only Ginsburg and Sotomayor voted against it. Justice Kennedy, long credited as a champion of gay rights, actually delivered the opinion. So what had happened was Charlie Craig and David Mullins had asked Phillips to bake a cake for their planned wedding, which they had to have in another state because Colorado hadn't yet legalized same-sex marriage. The court found that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission showed animus to Phillips based solely on his religion, which makes it a violation of the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause.
Yeah, I think it's more of a rights violation than that. I think even if it wasn't on a religious grounds, you can't force people against their will to work for you. It's very strange how the sort of progressive crowd, they call everything slavery, but then if you look at what they advocate for, I'm pretty sure that forced labor is the literal definition of slavery.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, really, this should just be about freedom of association. And like you said, religion really shouldn't have anything to do with it.
Well, that's what it is. And yeah, that's the narrative. It's on either side. It's freedom of religion, or it's gay people not being denied business. No, I think everybody is missing the bigger point here, is that you need to have the right to free association. Otherwise, you're basically just a forced laborer for everybody.
According to Craig, quote, "He simply turned us away just because of who we are instead of what we asked for. No, Craig, it was because of what you asked for. You asked for a wedding cake for a same-sex couple. He didn't say he wouldn't bake you any cake because of who you are." From the ruling, quote, "In 2012, he," that is Phillips, "told a same-sex couple that he would not create a cake for their wedding celebration because of his religious opposition to same-sex marriages that Colorado did not then recognize, but that he would sell them other baked goods, e.g. birthday cakes. So, Craig, you were not turned away for who you are. Stop whining. This is just more of this bogus leftist snowflake victim mentality. It has to be an attack on you instead of you wanting to force someone else to do something they didn't want to do." According to the ruling, quote, "The Commission's treatment of Phillips's case showed elements of a clear and impermissible hostility toward the sincere religious beliefs motivating his objection. As the record shows, some of the commissioners at the Commission's formal public hearings endorsed the view that religious beliefs cannot legitimately be carried into the public sphere or commercial domain, and compared his invocation of his sincerely held religious beliefs to defenses of slavery and the Holocaust. No commissioners objected to the comments." And I think that goes to what you just said. Phillips is like slavery for some reason, not the guys who wanted to force him to do work for him against his will.
Yeah, and what's really hilarious about that is you should have seen like The Wire and some of these more out there outlets, how they were covering it. The Wire seriously put out an article in response to this saying straight couples have a breeding advantage over LGBT people, and they need to legislate that breeding advantage, which I'm just like, wow, that is...
How do they think gay people get born to begin with?
Yeah, that's the first obvious problem. It's as if they've completely lost touch with biological reality. I see that, and my first thought was, wow, that is scarily similar to an argument that a eugenicist would make.
Exactly, yeah. Kennedy also pointed out that this viewpoint was incongruous with the Commission's ruling about bakers who didn't want to bake anti-gay cakes, and also the fact that they were willing to sell other products to those customers was relevant in the anti-gay cakes cases, but not Phillips.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that they don't really seem to realize. And again, this is just another example of where all you have to do is reverse the roles, and you can get these progressive types to start going against their own ideas. And in one of my recent videos, I did this where Matt Lieb, you know that guy in that Religion of Libertarianism video, he basically tried to make that same argument. Libertarians are against businesses being forced to serve black people. Well, what if it was a white person going into a business owned by a black person?
And as Kennedy points out, no member of the clergy could be compelled to form a ceremony for same-sex couples, so why should a baker be any different?
Well, exactly.
Kennedy concluded, quote, "For these reasons, the Commission's treatment of Phillips's case violated the state's duty under the First Amendment not to base laws or regulations on hostility to a religion or religious viewpoint. The government, consistent with the Constitution's guarantee of free exercise, cannot impose regulations that are hostile to the religious beliefs of effective citizens and cannot act in a manner that passes judgment on or presupposes the illegitimacy of religious beliefs and practices." Of course, like you said earlier, it would just have been a lot simpler to say that religion actually has nothing to do with it and everyone has right to freedom of association, but I mean, it's like everyone talks about, well, America is this capitalist country of unfettered capitalism. If it is, then why don't we have free of association in business dealings?
Oh, yeah, well, it hasn't been that way from the very beginning. In fact, one of the first things Washington did was he imposed tariffs on other countries.
Yeah, and then there was the whiskey tax, which was very protectionist. Say, if you're tired of the promos in this podcast, well, the patrons got it early and with no ads or promos. Just go to patreon.bogosity.tv and donate at any level. Do you have children, or nieces or nephews? Are you homeschooling, or just want to counter some of the socialist indoctrination most children get in school? If so, go to bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins, and you'll be taken to a website where you can get some great books for elementary-age children. The Tuttle Twins books are books about liberty and free market economics that include children's versions of Bastiat's The Law, Leonard Read's I, Pencil, and Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, as well as books about the Federal Reserve and how regulations protect business cronies. They'll learn about the harm caused by eminent domain, or regulations passed in the name of safety, and fundamental concepts of liberty. And as you can see from the sample pages on the website, they're all easy to read and nicely illustrated. They're just $9.99 a piece, or get a special discount as well as free bonuses when you purchase all 5. You can even buy in bulk to donate to schools and local libraries. So get the Tuttle Twins books at bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins. Another good ruling from the Supreme Court, they found 8-1 that the Fourth Amendment does provide protection against cops searching vehicles parked in driveways without a warrant. So for a while there's been this automobile exception to the Fourth Amendment, even though the Fourth Amendment leaves no room for exceptions, but the idea is that cops should have more leeway to search vehicles, like on the side of the road or something if they pull them over, since the owner could drive it away at any moment. Well, the state of Virginia wanted to expand this to include cars parked in the driveways of private residences.
I'm pretty sure that the stop and frisk style searches also violate the Fifth Amendment as well, because it's police assuming guilt.
Yeah, but that's a whole other story. And then, of course, that led to the papers, please things, where now you have to show a policeman your ID whenever he just asks for it. He doesn't have to have a reason. Got to show your papers. So what happened is 2 police officers were investigating a stolen motorcycle. They suspected the bike was one belonging to Ryan Collins because they saw pictures of it on Facebook. So Officer David Rhodes went to Collins's house and saw a tarp that looked like it might have a motorcycle underneath it. He went up to it, lifted the tarp, took pictures, and then ran the plates and waited for Collins to come home, at which point Collins was arrested and charged.
That's pretty scary.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court had to explain to these people that the automobile exception doesn't apply to anywhere a vehicle might happen to be at the time. Officer Rhodes had to violate Collins's Fourth Amendment rights to even begin to perform this search, and the issue is what they call curtilage, which basically means the area around a person's property, usually considered up to the property line, but basically anywhere where someone might be making active use of it. But, quote, the part of the driveway where Collins's motorcycle was parked and subsequently searched is curtilage. When Officer Rhodes searched the motorcycle, it was parked inside a partially enclosed top portion of the driveway that abuts the house. Just like the front porch, side garden, or area outside the front window, that enclosure constitutes an area adjacent to home and to which the activity of home life extends. Because the scope of the automobile exception extends no further than the automobile itself, it did not justify Officer Rhodes' invasion of the curtilage. Nothing in this court's case law suggests that the automobile exception gives an officer the right to enter a home or its curtilage to access a vehicle without a warrant. Such an expansion would both undervalue the core Fourth Amendment protection afforded to the home and its curtilage and untether the exception from the justifications underlying it. Contrary to Virginia's claim, the automobile exception is not a categorical one that permits the warrantless search of a vehicle anytime, anywhere, including in a home or curtilage. This court has long been clear that curtilage is afforded constitutional protection, and creating a carve-out for certain types of curtilage seems more likely to create confusion than does uniform application of the court's doctrine. They also found, quote, Virginia's rule also rests on a mistaken premise, for the ability to observe inside curtilage from a lawful vantage point is not the same as the right to enter curtilage without a warrant to search for information not otherwise accessible. In other words, if Rhodes had been on a public sidewalk and saw the motorcycle out in the open from there, that would have been one thing, and especially if he had been able to see the license plate and run the place from there. But he had to enter Collins's property and look under a tarp to see it.
Yeah, I don't... How would you even compare seeing something in plain sight to having to go onto their property and lift the tarp? Whoever was making that argument was incredibly desperate.
But, I mean, that's the problem when you start to allow exceptions of our rights. You know, a lot of people think, well, you know, the vehicle exception, okay, that sounds reasonable, but then it always gets expanded and expanded, and fortunately, in this case at least, the Supreme Court put a stop to it.
Well, that's why I say at least that even if you have a minarchy, it eventually will dissolve. I mean, I have an economic explanation for why it has to, but you're going to get all these people who are going to attempt to try and redefine the laws any way that they see fit. And what's exactly to stop them? I mean, either way, the state forces itself onto you and it makes its own definitions of what it does. So that's inherently what you're going to get out of that, especially if you pile that on top of an organization which is unaccountable because it doesn't have any competition, doesn't have any incentive to be accountable.
If you're on the Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or hotel, anyone on that network can get your traffic. Do you really trust all of those strangers? For that matter, do you really trust your ISP? A VPN can protect you from prying eyes, disguise your location, and even foil government censors. It's essential in this day and age, so go to vpn.bogosity.tv and you'll be taken to BoxPN. Starting at just $2.99 a month, you can get unlimited high-speed connections to VPN servers all over the world, and they don't log connections, so your privacy is assured. Traveling abroad, just VPN home, and don't worry about what those other governments are doing. Back at home, stop your ISP from traffic shaping and messing with the quality internet access you're paying good money for. You can connect from multiple machines at once, including your smartphone or tablet, and it supports all the secure standards, including OpenVPN and SSTP. Bypass censors and surveillance with your own secure VPN connection. Go to vpn.bogosity.tv. You know, the very first story we ever covered on this podcast was about the Fukushima nuclear disaster and all the bogus fear-mongering that occurred in its wake, and we continued talking about it for months, and now, 7 years later, we're still talking about it.
Oh yeah, I love nuclear energy fear-mongering, because a lot of the people who fear-monger about nuclear energy don't even know like the first thing about how nuclear reactors work nowadays.
Well, and a lot of them are like, well, we have to stop global warming. Well, okay, here we go. You got carbon-free power right there, and it's cheap and efficient. And it's really amazing to me how an earthquake and tsunami can kill 15,000 people, but none of that seems to get mentioned because everyone's losing their minds over the nuclear power disaster, the fallout from which still cannot be attributed to a single death. But once again, like we've seen before, we see someone telling the truth about the disaster becoming a pariah. Shunichi Yamashita grew up in Nagasaki and began his research looking at the health of the survivors of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. He also visited Ukraine more than 100 times to research the Chernobyl incident. According to Yamashita, at Chernobyl you had 28 immediate deaths from rescue workers and about 50 cases of untreated thyroid cancers. But other than that, the death toll from radiation has been pretty minimal. So when this happened in his home country of Japan in March 2011, he immediately began advising local authorities about radiation, and he helped set up a health survey of the 150,000 people who were evacuated after the accident. 2 years later, he'd been completely drummed out because his findings didn't fit their narrative. The problem, he pointed out, wasn't the radiation, but the fear of radiation. Since the government stupidly didn't give out any information about radiation levels after Fukushima, people's imaginations ran wild, and you had nurses deserting their patients, doctors refused to come in from outside to help, even the Red Cross turned tail and ran, they abandoned the hospitals and evac centers where thousands of people were gathering. Supplies couldn't even come in because no one wanted to drive into the danger zone. But as it turns out, and as we covered, the radiation danger was very minimal. Less than 1% got a dose of more than 1 millisievert. And for comparison, a spinal X-ray is 2 millisieverts. An airline flight from New York to Tokyo will get you 9 millisieverts. And the lowest dose from which any form of cancer has been shown to result is 100 millisieverts.
Yeah, so wasn't that big of a deal.
Right. And Chernobyl residents got 350 millisieverts, and that's what caused the thyroid cancers I mentioned. And what happens is you get this radioactive isotope of iodine, iodine-131. That gets into the thyroid because that's what the thyroid does, is it uses iodine, and that causes thyroid cancer. But if you take potassium iodide pills right after the disaster, what it does is it floods the thyroid with stable iodine, and so it doesn't take in much of the radioactive iodine, and you can prevent or at least reduce the risk of cancer.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I know this too because I live near a nuclear power plant, and like every 10 years or so, they send us new Ki pills, potassium iodide, just in case there's a disaster, which, of course, it's extremely unlikely. Iodine-131 levels released from Fukushima was tiny, and most of that went out to sea, and it wasn't a danger to humans. The half-life of iodine-131 is just a tiny bit over 8 days, so basically it's gone in a month. And also authorities quickly removed any foodstuffs that might have been contaminated, and they also issued Ki tablets. So everything should have been fine, but something happened to kick the panic into high gear as if it needed anything else. 2 years after the accident, long before any cases of thyroid cancer from radiation would show up, they did an ultrasound survey, and they found 113 cases of thyroid cancer, when in the same population, they should have expected to find only 4. Now, that sounds terrible, right?
It does.
Except they would have expected to find 4 in a population that isn't being screened. And the reason they did this survey was so they could understand what that figure should be in a healthy population that is being screened. But that's not how the news media interpreted. I mean, if you're going to screen everyone, of course you're going to find a lot more cases. But the news media ran with the scare.
Of course they did. Anything to keep us from going away from oil, right?
I guess, because it seems like everywhere they say, oh, we're going to do solar and wind, and they put all of it in, they end up doing more oil and natural gas. So I guess if you love power from oil and natural gas, you want to support the renewables, because they're just too unreliable.
Yeah, the renewable energy, it's more expensive and it's way more dangerous, so you're going to have a harder time implementing that, and I think they know it.
One local politician, Bɪᴛᴄᴏɪ, said, if you say radiation doesn't cause a problem, how can we have so many cases? The government can't give an answer to that. Yes, it can, because if you screen for more cases, you find more cases. The high rates were expected because you are finding cases that wouldn't have been diagnosed otherwise. But as radiation expert Ken Nollett said, quote, it's very difficult to convince the public about this, and when we try, we're seen as complicit in nuclear power.
Complicit in nuclear power. Man, it's just, that doesn't even make sense.
I guess they're basically calling him a shill or something.
A shill for cheaper energy? Okay.
And something else to consider. Plenty of people around the world have experienced those same radiation levels, absent any nuclear disasters. Since there haven't been any increases in cancer among those populations, it stands to reason there shouldn't have been any at Fukushima either. In fact, Fukushima itself may have been one of the safer places to be during the tsunami because you didn't have the same risk of drowning that you did closer to the coast in many other places. So yeah, the real disaster wasn't the nuclear disaster, it was the panic. People were herded out quickly, but that means that invalids and elderly were left behind. According to pediatrician C쏘sဃ, quote, one woman called the ambulance from within the exclusion zone because she needed regular oxygen therapy and nobody had come to give it. And between 40 and 60 elderly people died either from being left behind or from the trauma of the evacuation.
That's the most concerning thing to me about the media's mass manipulation tactics, and the most successful one, obviously, is hysteria and panic.
And in fact, out of 1,200 elderly in care homes, those who were evacuated were 3 times more likely to have died in the next 2 years than those who were not evacuated. And according to local Dr. Claire Leppold, the evacuation resulted in 85 suicides, even more cases of depression, evacuees drink more, exercise less, and she concluded, quote, the evacuation may have been more dangerous than the disaster for this population. And most of the evacuation zone is still abandoned, but Yamashita said that most people could have returned home after a month when the iodine-131 had decayed.
Yeah, so that stuff doesn't last very long.
Yeah, half-life of a little over 8 days after a month. There's trace amounts left.
Yeah, and the media, well, it's mostly the media, but also the history books do a fair good job of this as well. Paint it as if nuclear energy is around for thousands of years. That maybe it is if it's in higher doses over a long period of time.
Well, the nuclear waste they're producing today, I think it'll fall below background levels in something like 300 years. The problem is, it's really difficult to get permission to build new nuclear power facilities, so you have all these old places like Fukushima. They're having to keep using and maintaining these old ones because it's so difficult to get permission to build new ones with the newer technologies.
Yeah, and that's all government regulations do. People act like they keep everyone safer. Well, no. Another problem is people don't know how to distinguish between rhetoric and proposing something and what it actually does, and literally all they do is just make things more expensive.
Well, one time I was looking at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and seeing who was on there, and one thing I couldn't see was any actual nuclear scientists. They were all either lawyers or environmental scientists. or even just environmentalists who weren't scientists.
Yeah, that figures.
And I mean, in this case with Fukushima, you have people who were basically subjected to psychological torture after what was already a terrible time. And I mean, it's far worse that we keep seeing yet again, people who point out the truth are shamed and even threatened by those who would just keep that disastrous panic continuing on.
Well, in times of universal deceit, people who speak the truth are hated.
We live in a world where light bulbs connect to the internet, and recent attacks on them prove that your online security is under threat like never before. Not only your websites, but the internet-enabled devices you buy. And the biggest problem is weak passwords. That's why you need LastPass. LastPass allows you to randomly generate strong, unique passwords on the web and on your internet-enabled devices, all protected by one master password. LastPass sets up in minutes and gives you secure automatic logins throughout the web, synchronizing across all your browsers, all your computers, and even your mobile devices, at home, at work, or on the road. It even securely stores sensitive form data, including credit card numbers, backup sensitive documents, software licenses, Wi-Fi logins, and more. And with LastPass Premium, you can get these benefits on other applications, manage passwords for your entire family, and also get priority customer support. Sign up at password.bogosity.tv for a free month of LastPass Premium. Log in securely everywhere using the last password you'll ever have to remember. Go to password.bogosity.tv and get LastPass now. And now it's time to mispunctuate this week's biggest bogon emitter. And remember last week when I quipped that GDPR should apply to governments too? Well, guess what? The European Commission not only is not compliant with the GDPR, they claim, as politicians usually do, that they're exempt from it.
Yeah, it seems to be sort of the base rule for the EU. Well, I mean, the entire GDPR in its premise is basically just an act of cyber imperialism, so it doesn't surprise me that they're holding themselves to different standards than what the bill claims is for the public.
Yeah, I mean, you see that all over the world, too. I mean, we talked about that with Obamacare, how politicians kept exempting themselves and their cronies from it. Well, if it's such a good idea, you know.
Yeah, well, the EU, they're just the kings or queens of that. They make these laws and then the politicians claim that they're exempt from them, and they'll do it very blatantly too. I mean, we have that in the US and we have that in other countries as well. It's just they're not as blatant about it.
And despite the fact that EU Commissioner Vera Jourova claimed that complying with GDPR was so easy that even she could do it, the EU Parliament's website, as it turns out, isn't compliant, doing things like tracking visitors without anonymizing their IP. And the European Commission isn't compliant either. Their website was found to have leaked the personal information of over 700 people, including names, postal codes, and email addresses, as well as violating GDPR regulations about third-party cookies. Now, if a private company had done that, they would definitely have been cited with a breach of the GDPR.
Yeah, well, that's the point, is that it's not about privacy or security, it's just about censorship. I mean, I don't know how much more simple it could be. I mean, as I was looking through the bill on page 111, it says pretty clearly, Part 7 of the supplementary and final provisions, the Secretary of State may, by regulations, make provision for representative bodies to bring proceedings before a court or tribunal in England or Wales or Northern Ireland combining two or more relevant claims. In this section, a relevant claim in relation to a representative body means a claim in respect of a right of a data subject which the representative body is authorized to exercise on the data subject's behalf under Article 80 of the GDPR. So
you might have to translate that for me a little bit. I didn't quite follow it.
Okay, well, basically, the Secretary of State can revise their terms anytime that they want, based on their own subjective definitions.
So the Secretary of State sees a website that he or she doesn't like, and they just say, oh, okay, I'm just going to say that violates the GDPR, and and file a complaint over it.
Yeah, they pretty much can do that, and it didn't take me very long to find something that says that in the GDPR.
And an article in the Daily and Sunday Express said, quote, "This leak would normally constitute a breach of the GDPR if other organizations had done it themselves. However, a spokesman for the commission said, based on legal reasons, European institutions are separate from the GDPR. Rules for thee, but not for me."
Well, I mean, that should tell you something, that the EU admits that they can't even live up to their own standard of censorship because they would be censored by their own standards. What it should tell you even more is that the U.S. is still, we still have our own government problems, but in the U.S. It was founded on Lockean principles, so over here there's more of a narrative that the state should be accountable to its own laws, even though it's not. A politician over here, there would be outrage, and there is outrage when they say things like they're above the law or whatever, but over there, it seems to be relatively silent.
Well, I mean, you don't expect the great and the good to have to follow the same rules as the peasantry, do you?
Oh, of course, because there's no such thing as an objective ethical standard.
So for the third time this year, the European Commission gets named this week's biggest bogon emitter. If you're going to shop online, use our special links to shop at Amazon. Clear your cookies and go to amazon.bogosity.tv, and you won't pay a penny more for your purchase. If you haven't used the mobile app in the last 12 months, or even at all, go to get5.bogosity.tv on your phone or tablet and get $5 off your order of $10 or more. Go to prime.bogosity.tv for a free 30-day trial of Amazon Prime and enjoy thousands of movies and TV episodes, borrowed Kindle books, and get unlimited 2-day shipping for free. And speaking of Kindle, go to kindle.bogosity.tv for a 30-day free trial to Kindle Unlimited. Read over 1 million books and listen to thousands of audiobooks on any device. You can go to music.bogosity.tv and get a free 30-day trial of Amazon Music Unlimited with access to Amazon's entire library of 10 million songs, ad-free and with unlimited skips, and even download to listen offline. All great ways to help this podcast simply by shopping at Amazon. And now let's decertify this week's Idiot Extraordinaire! And we've criticized the AMA before, but they've actually done a good thing recently in opposing a national 3-day limit on opioid prescriptions, which is done, of course, out of concern for an epidemic that, as we've covered repeatedly, just isn't happening. Republican Senator Rob Portman of Ohio introduced the bill with his spokesman saying, quote, "People are dying around the country every single day because patients are being prescribed too many opioid pills at one time." That has nothing to do with it, Portman. In fact, as we covered, overdoses are going up as prescriptions are going down. It's happening because pain patients can't get the prescriptions, and in desperation, they turn to the black market where they have no idea what they're getting, how potent it is, or what it's cut with.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's pretty obvious. I mean, you get a completely regulated market with a relatively high demand. Well, you get bootlegs.
And insert Archer meme here. Do you want more overdoses? Because that's how you get more overdoses.
I mean, just every time that they've ever tried prohibition, why are they still trying prohibition? It doesn't work.
Quote, "A 3-day limit is common sense based on CDC guidelines, and Senator Portman is going to stand up and fight for what is right. The problem is, it isn't the CDC guidelines, and also appeal to common sense is a fallacy, but the CDC guidelines actually say, quote, when opioids are used for acute pain, clinicians should prescribe the lowest effective dose of immediate release opioids and should prescribe no greater quantity than needed for the expected duration of pain severe enough to require opioids. 3 days or less will often be sufficient. More than 7 days will rarely be needed." And CDC guidelines also say, quote, Clinical decision-making should be based on a relationship between the clinician and patient and an understanding of the patient's clinical situation, functioning, and life context. The recommendations in the guideline are voluntary rather than prescriptive standards. Clinicians should consider the circumstances and unique needs of each patient when providing care. In other words, not by a politician who has no medical training and hasn't examined any of these patients.
Right, exactly. And that's just a good way to tell when you should avoid something, whether it's a political position or just an argument, is if it's commonly used on that side of the argument of appealing to common sense. You see that all over the place with climate change regulation or raising the minimum wage or gun control. You hear that all the time. It's common sense. Well, if it's common sense, you should be able to explain it in a way that most people would understand.
Yeah, if it were common sense, you shouldn't have to say that it's common sense. You could just explain why it makes sense.
Right. It's pretty self-evident what you're doing. All you're doing is skipping explaining your position and just telling people what they should think about it.
And also, Republicans want to get the government out of healthcare unless doctors are prescribing medicine they don't like, in which case, get the government into healthcare.
Yeah, no, they don't. They just want to cut spending on it slightly. They don't want to get rid of public health care. You could see that with what Trump's doing. Republicans love universal health care, and it's pretty obvious as to why they love it. It's because it gives them something to run against, and by cutting spending to it, they can pretend that they're doing something about it.
Yeah, they can be the loyal opposition.
Yeah. And it's pretty obvious. I don't know why there aren't more people who see that.
And unfortunately, politicians and even healthcare providers have been misinterpreting these CDC guidelines as a call for strict limits and also applying it to chronic pain as well as acute. Such a limitation would leave many chronic pain sufferers bedridden and even suicidal, as we've covered before. In fact, 2 states, Florida and Kentucky, have already imposed 3-day limits. Florida will allow 7-day prescriptions, quote, if medically necessary, based on provider professional judgment. Now, think about what that means. That means that in Florida, if you're a doctor, you cannot write prescriptions for more than 7 days, even if it is medically necessary based on provider professional judgment.
Yeah, aren't there plenty of people who go under surgeries who ask for medication after 7 days?
Oh, yeah. I mean, some surgeries, you can be in pain for months afterward. It just depends on how bad it is, whether or not there are any complications or whatever.
Yay, so you're putting people in agonizing pain for weeks on end. No wonder so many people turn to the black market.
Yeah, I mean, pain's a great motivator, And besides, what does a prescription mean other than an expression of medical necessity based on provider professional judgment? I mean, isn't that the whole point of prescriptions to begin with? That's why government passed all these laws about them.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, it's more so the government can control what people get what and the manufacturers of the medication.
So thankfully, the AMA came out against this, saying, quote, a strict 3-day limit ignores the admonition from the CDC guideline that clinical decision-making should be based on a relationship between clinician and patient, an understanding of the patient's clinical situation, functioning, and life context, misstates the actual recommendation of the CDC, and applies limits to clinical situations to which they were not intended to be applied. Most patients with opioid use disorder have trouble accessing care as payers and others put up obstacles.
I think that's the most awful part about regulation, just of any kind. That's creating the problem. And all the government's doing is just pointing at the market and saying, look, it's because of this unregulated aspect of society, we need more regulation.
And that brings us to this week's moron, Jackie Kucinich of the Daily Beast. She says that the reason this limit hasn't been made mandatory is that Congress is too scared of the AMA.
What? Oh, man.
Yeah, I guess To her, the AMA is like the NRA is to gun control people. The only reason we have guns in this country is because the NRA has spent zillions of dollars to buy off politicians. Sounds like the same thing to me.
Yeah, I mean, forget the long history of political funding against drug use and against the freedom of trading.
Her article begins, "As the opioid epidemic ravages the country..." No, it doesn't. We've debunked this so many times, it's embarrassing. And I mean, not only does she blindly and uncritically accept the insane claims of these politicians, she acts like anyone not calling for more regulation of healthcare is just in the pocket of the AMA and is calling for nothing less than the destruction of all society. But no, it's this insane war on drugs that's causing all the destruction, because politicians get their little panties in a wad over the thought of a few people getting high. We have barriers in the way of legal means of using drugs, not only to get high, but for other reasons as well, such as pain relief. Hospitals make patients suffer because they limit their morphine way below what's necessary to avoid health risks. Doctors refuse to help patients manage their pain for fear of having their license pulled. People who have no criminal background whatsoever are subjected to regular drug testing. If anything, pain sufferers are way under-medicated, and politicians are trying to make it worse.
Yeah, that's just cruel.
So all of that makes Jackie Kucinich this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire.
Well, that wraps up this "I don't think I can pick up too much garbage with these handcuffs on" edition of the Bogosity podcast. Come join the discussion at forum.bogosity.tv or discord.bogosity.tv, and feel free to send a question, statement, news article, or rant in text or audio to podcast@bogosity.tv. This podcast depends on you to keep going, so please donate using the links on the website or the QR codes in the thumbnail, or support Shane DK on Patreon or Maker Support to get the podcast and YouTube videos early and without ads or promos. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Esoteric Entity for joining me.
No problem. Yeah, it was a pleasure being on.
Until next time, here's a quote from Robert Todd Carroll. "History is replete with examples of what happens when any group of authorities do not have to answer to empirical evidence, but are free to define truth as they see fit. None of the examples has a happy ending." The Bogosity podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.
Bogosity.
Want answers to creationist claims against evolution? Would you like to know more about evolution yourself, or even engage creationists more directly, with actual peer-reviewed sources to back you up? My book, How Evolution is Scientific, is designed to show the basics of evolutionary theory and how it is so well supported using the scientific method. It's impeccably sourced, with references to the actual scientific material, and is arranged using the creationists' own criteria of what is scientific. Using their own arguments against them, see how evolution is scientific, but creationism is not, based on observations, accurate predictions, logic, and evidence. Get answers to common creationist claims, and even a primer on abiogenesis, the start of all life. It's all in my book, How Evolution is Scientific, available at Amazon and on Kindle, EPUB, and PDF as well. Get How Evolution is Scientific and never be taken in by creationists again.